welcome to GHTV Talks. I'm Laura Lourenco.
And I'm John Pattee. Today we'll be discussing some aspects of the legalization of marijuana in Canada. But first, here's James with the weather.
Thanks, John. This past weekend exceeded our predicted highs, so I hope you got out to enjoy the weather. We're headed for some even better temperatures in the near future, but we're going to see a few days of rain and even a chance of snow before that happens. Starting with today, Environment Canada issued a weather statement this morning saying that we could get up to 30 millimeters of rain. This rain is expected to continue through Tuesday night, but the heaviest part will be in the late afternoon. The weather will stay warm for the next 24 hours thanks to a combined front from the south, but you're still going to need to keep that umbrella handy. Looking at your short-term forecast, on Wednesday we should have a calmer day with only a 30% chance of showers and a high-pressure system from the north over the area. A warm front is going to come through and push out that high-pressure system, which will give us some rain and possible snow for Thursday and Friday, with lows of Friday going below -2. Once the warm front has moved in, you can expect some nice temperatures for the weekend, moving towards almost 20 degrees as we start the new week. I'm James Robinson. Thanks for joining me.
Welcome back. We're joined today by special guest Emma Norman. She currently attends the University of Toronto and is originally from the state of Colorado, which legalized marijuana in January of 2014. Hi Emma, thank you so much for being here today.
Of course, thank you for having me.
So just to kick this conversation off, it's big news for Canada. The Liberal government said that it will be making an announcement soon officially that marijuana will be legalized throughout Canada by Canada Day of 2018. So just to throw out the first most important question probably is, what are the general thoughts here on the legalization of marijuana in Canada? Laura, would you want to start that off? Or?
Yeah, so personally, I'm kind of neutral. If it happens, that's great for people who voted for Trudeau. For some people voted for Trudeau for that exact reason. So I mean, that's great that they're getting whatever he promised. If it doesn't, to be honest, it doesn't affect me that much. For the business world, I feel like apparently from what I've been hearing, the stock market jumped tremendously the past year based on Trudeau being in power and the talk about legalizing marijuana. So from a business perspective, I think that's great. But yeah, for me, it's not, like I said, it won't really affect me too much.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things to touch on in terms of the pros and cons. I think a big talking point, though, will be also safety in a sense. If the government does decide in some provinces to do some more regulated distribution at like primary locations, then maybe that will create more safety in terms of what's going into the substance and the drug. And speaking of distribution, Emma, do you think there will be, in Ontario at least, do you think there will be primary centers in which it will be distributed, kind of like an LCBO or a beer store, or do you think dispensaries will still maintain like how they are now?
Well, I would say based on the fact that the government hasn't really shut down the dispensaries that currently exist, kind of makes me think that they wouldn't start like shutting down them after marijuana is actually legalized, just because of the general trend of things. It would seem kind of strange to me if they like shut down the dispensaries. But on the other hand, I do think it's kind of important to have just a uniform way that you control these substances. So if there are like these big distribution centers like the LCBO, maybe it would be a good idea to create those for pot as well.
And as far as selling goes, any thoughts on legal age? Same as alcohol, something different?
There's a lot of talk right now that it's going to be around 18 is what they're thinking, and between provinces they can kind of establish. I think, yeah, it should be the drinking age. At that moment, you kind of know what's right and what's wrong. You kind of hopefully know your limit by then and like when to stop. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would say I think it should be around drinking age, definitely not younger.
I definitely agree. That's the way it is in Colorado. The drinking age is 21, and that's the same age that you have to be in order to buy marijuana. And I think that that's a pretty good way of doing it, because with any controlled substance, there are like dangers, and you have to be old enough to like know what you're doing with them. So if people think that like you are unable to like use these substances if you're 21 or 18 or 19, then like why would they think that you're able to use one substance at 21 but that you're fine to use another one at 18? I think it should all be uniform.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you asked if about LCBO and it kind of getting in there. Do you guys feel like it should be sold at LCBO or should it have its own separate location?
Personally, I think there obviously is a major discussion and potentially a problem when it comes to cost. Okay, like developing these separate, buildings and whatnot, and to create a space where it could be sold. However, another point that would be kind of contentious a little bit is if weed was to be sold in LCBOs or beer stores even, I don't know, there's also kind of the issue, there's a lot of different varying opinions on what the legal age should be. So if you're in a store where the legal age of most, if not all of the products are 19, but weed is a different age, there's kind of the conflict of, people, maybe people get away with certain purchases they're not allowed to get away with. That's what I think. I think it's just odd to conflict ages if there is a conflict in the ages.
I definitely agree. I also think that there could be a danger. Then if they're sold in the same store, then are you somehow encouraging people to use these substances together, which obviously people do, and like people don't die if they use marijuana and alcohol at the same time. But I think it's always important to exercise caution. So you have to be careful that you're not encouraging these substances to be used at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and with when this does happen, if marijuana is more available, do you guys think there'd be a concern with being under the influence while driving? So there's a lot of campaigns out for drinking and driving, but how about this? What are your thoughts?
You can go ahead, Emma, if you want.
Oh, well, I think from my experience in Colorado, there's very similar laws about whether you're under the influence of alcohol or whether you're under the influence of marijuana. You're obviously not supposed to be under the influence of either when you're driving. I don't really have any personal experience with this. I've heard that if you're driving under the influence of alcohol, you'll go really fast versus if you're driving under the influence of marijuana, you'll drive really slow. But both of these can be dangerous. Maybe there is more of there's definitely not the same stigma of driving under the influence of marijuana as there is about alcohol, so maybe people wouldn't be as careful. So if marijuana is legalized, maybe they should put some efforts into a campaign to raise awareness about that.
Definitely.
I think what's interesting is this topic, and most likely a lot of the other subtopics about legalizing weed would be, it kind of does come back to how it would be distributed, because if it is sold and distributed at a government regulated place, then the government would probably want to implement drink responsibly, you smoke responsibly, or things like that. There would be more government regulation in that sense. However, if there's more dispensary power and stuff like that, if they have more control over the market in terms of selling weed, then maybe it would just be more up to the opinion and decision of those people who own the independent dispensaries. So it really, I think, can be brought back down to the question of how it's going to be sold as well.
Yeah, just to bring back to your point, I think it's definitely yours as well, it's definitely going to be up to campaigning. So it's going to be up to the government and what they're kind of putting out there to tell people, this is not right. We all assume that people know this, however, they might not think it's that important, especially the people, kids in high school, they might not think that it's a big deal. But I know for myself, I've driven even just tired, and you could see how, distracting things can get, and you're like, oh, wow, I didn't notice that just from being tired. So I don't have personal experience with being under the influence, but I can imagine how that could impact you, and even if I'm tired, how that impacts me. Mm-hmm. So I think, it's definitely agreeing with both your points that campaigning is really an issue here.
So just in terms of one of the topics that comes up with legalizing weed is also growing it yourself. I know one of the CBC reports that came out, who first reported about this announcement, said that the idea being thrown out there is some households will be able to grow up to 4 plants. And I know where you're from, Colorado, it says 6. What does growing look like there from the legal stance?
Well, in my experience, I don't think I actually know anyone who grows their own marijuana. I think that that's generally just more the people who are really like marijuana enthusiasts will do it, as far as I'm aware. Yeah, I don't really have any personal experience about it. I think it is kind of, it's maybe a bit of a, like, you just do it for fun. Like, you're like, oh, this is my weed plant. Like, look at it. Rather than a, necessarily like an issue that, needs to be worried about.
Okay, and one thing that's kind of brought up here is if a household is only allowed to have 4 of these plants, how are private sectors going to compete in this market?
I don't know the details behind if there's maybe specific people who are allowed to grow 4 plants in their household. Maybe there will be sort of an emphasis given to people with medical need. It's kind of interesting because if it's government run, then they might have more control over a medical substance, whereas if there's somebody who needs medical marijuana, would they grow it in their own house for their own need? It's a very interesting conversation in that sense, where maybe the issue does come down to, okay, what is the weed needed for? And then if it is decided that the need is for medical reasons, would that be up to the hands of the government, or would it be in the hands of the person who needs that for the medical reason?
All right, and do you think it's going to be licensed like alcohol is, or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a very interesting discussion, because there are still so many ideas as to how it will be used. Because with alcohol, it's alcohol, it's leisurely, it's for fun, it's social, it's things of that nature. Whereas there's so many different uses. It's maybe anxiety related, medically related, also leisure as well. So I think the licensing would have to have a lot of different takes as to what the purpose behind somebody selling them is, and why they would need a license to do it. What are their motivations?
Okay, and now moving into the edible part of this. So weed is not just you smoking it. You can also put it in food, and the most common type is like desserts. So like brownies, cookies, that kind of stuff. Do you think that businesses will be able to incorporate these kind of desserts or food types? Because I know in Colorado that they have chocolate bars that have marijuana in them. So, I mean, are we gonna, in Canada, have that as well? Could you go into a bakery and pick up a brownie of that sort, or?
Well, I would say this kind of goes off the question of licensing as well. When you sell alcohol, you need to have a license for it. And if marijuana is going to be treated the same as alcohol, and if it's going to be a controlled substance, as they call it, then I think that you would probably need a license to sell marijuana as well, whether that be just in like the bud form, or like as like canna butter, or in edible form. So it's probably not something, like it's not something that you want like children to get their hands on. I know that we've had issues with that in Colorado. If things aren't labeled properly, like people will just be like, it's a piece of chocolate, and then you eat it and you're like, oh my God, I've made a huge mistake. So I think it's really important that there's like a distinction made, like for these like edibles or whatever. So I think like businesses do need to be very careful about that, and like definitely look into like licensing this sort of thing so that accidents don't happen.
Well, there is a lot of things to touch on here, and we've had some very varied conversation here. We could go on for ages, I'm sure, but it is time to wrap it up. So I want to thank Laura for joining this discussion, and thank you to our guest, Emma. Please tune into the Wednesday segment of GHTV as well, where you can get your sports, news, and entertainment update. Thank you for joining us for the Monday segment. I'm John Pattee.
I'm Laura Lourenco.
We'll see you next week.